So I'm going to kick off with a sort of fairly high level look at this. If I can find my slides. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, my presentation is very ambitiously called "Good Metadata Could Help Save the World," but I think this is actually true. I'm Alice Meadows. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the National Information Standards Organisation, NISO. I'm also, just for another couple of weeks, the President of the Society for Scholarly Publishing, and I'm a co-founder of a small consulting organisation that works with organisations in the research world, and in particular open research, called More Brains Cooperative. So to start off with a bit of a definition of what metadata is. I'm sure everybody is familiar and you all have your own definition, but I think it's always helpful to kind of start off with a sort of framing of what we're going to be talking about. So metadata is the data that provides information about other data about data, basically. And there are a number of different sorts of data, and importantly, I think for the purposes of this talk, it's used for discovery and identification. So the things that I'm going to focus on primarily are metadata for discovery and metadata for sort of recognition, for equity, for those kind of issues. And I apologise, I put this in the wrong place. I thought I had it as my first slide, so I'm now going to slightly backtrack and say, before I continue on, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the town of Brookline, where I'm based, is located on the tribal homelands of the Massachusetts people. I acknowledge the continuing presence of the Massachusetts and the neighbouring Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples in my town, as well as the other indigenous peoples who are represented here. The Massachusetts tribe are the descendants of the original people that the English invaders first encountered in what is now the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and tribal members continue to survive as Massachusetts people through the retention of their oral traditions. Theirs is the indigenous nation from whom the present-day Commonwealth of Massachusetts took its name. And I also acknowledge the two federally recognised tribes within Massachusetts, the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead-Aquina and the Mashpee Wampanoag tribes. And I would also like to take this opportunity to encourage you to consider, I support an organisation called First Nations, which does wonderful work with the First Nation tribes in our country, and I strongly encourage you to take a look at their work and consider supporting them as well. So sorry to get that slightly in the wrong order, but now back to the metadata. And I have cribbed quite a bit for this talk on the work of Metadata 2020, which was an initiative that was originally kicked off by Crossref, but involved a much broader community of organisations and individuals. It was called Metadata 2020 because we intended to finish our work at the end of 2020, which we did, but you can still go on and find lots of very useful information in the website that's still going and still being maintained. But this was an initiative to really try to encourage the use of better metadata and what that looks like, what that means. So I've made a number of references to it throughout this presentation. So I thought we'd start by thinking about what actually good metadata looks like. And as part of the Metadata 2020 project, we came up with these 4 C's. So it needs to be compatible. This is all about interoperability, and also it needs to be sort of usable by people as well as by machines. So making it open and interoperable and machine actionable, as well as human readable as much as possible, is really important. Ideally, it also needs to be complete. I slightly, not take issue, I slightly push back on this because I think that we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So although complete metadata obviously is wonderful and ideal, I think it's probably better to have good partial metadata than complete but bad metadata. But having said that, as much as possible, what you want to do is to reflect the content and relationships and components of metadata. So make it as complete and comprehensive as you can. But I would say making it as good as you can is sort of trumps that. It needs to be credible, it needs to be trustworthy. So making sure that the provenance is clear and that the information is accurate so that it will be discoverable and long-lived is really important. And it needs to be curated. It's not like pretty much everything in scholarly communications, nothing is fixed, everything is constantly evolving. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the reasons why this is so important, but basically maintaining metadata over time is really critical as well. So could better metadata really save the world? Well, I actually wrote a Scholarly Kitchen post about this a few years ago, which I've shamelessly quoted from at the bottom here. And it was as part of my work with Metadata 2020. But I think, you know, really it is one of the ways that we can help save the world. And I've just pulled out a few areas that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail that I think back this up. So high quality open metadata makes research discoverable. Metadata standards enable interoperability and sharing. Metadata can accelerate or suppress equity, and I think we need to be very mindful of that. And metadata supports contributor recognition, which I think is an important aspect of both discoverability and equity as well. So to take each of those in turn, first of all, high quality open metadata makes research discoverable. And the example I want to give here, I can't name names, I'm afraid, but a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine in the UK, works for a small development studies organisation that has a publications programme. And they, for many years, have made all their publications openly available and were completely convinced that that was all they needed to do. And when my friend joined them as their publications manager, she lobbied very hard for them to at least start getting DOIs for their publications. And they took a lot of persuading, but when they finally did agree to join Crossref and start registering DOIs for their publications, they found in the first year, they had a more than fourfold increase in page views of their publications, from less than around 200,000 to close to 1 million page views in a year. So I think it's really important to remember that open does not equal discoverable, and what you need to make content discoverable is really good metadata. Standards, metadata standards enable interoperability and sharing, which is super important. I think persistent identifiers are a really good example of this, because by using persistent identifiers, which include DOIs, but also things like ORCID identifiers and RAW and other organization IDs, grant IDs, and so on, you can seamlessly share accurate data about the people, places, and things, both within and between systems. And re-entering data and all the problems that causes is a source of immense frustration for many researchers and their organizations. It's also, you know, it costs time and therefore it costs money. And again, sorry for the shameless self-plug, but with my More Brains hat on, I and my colleagues did some work with JISC in the UK to complete a cost-benefit analysis of what the savings would be if the UK higher education sector, there was widespread adoption of 5 sort of what they considered core persistent identifiers. And if the evaluation we did looked at what the savings would be if the metadata for those PIDs was reused just once, and clearly we know that it's reused many more times than that, but just with one reuse of metadata, the cost savings are going to be something like £5 million. So really significant cost savings, never mind everything else. So metadata can accelerate equity, and I think there's many examples of this, but I think that metadata that helps accessibility is a good example. It enables visually impaired readers to access content equitably, but I think it's really important to remember that doing so making content accessible levels the playing field for everyone. It's not just those who are visually impaired or have other disabilities that make it helpful. You know, we're all going to get old one day and our eyesight is going to fail and we're going to be visually impaired ourselves, but also this sort of equity of access is helpful in so many ways. It enables participation by so many more people than would otherwise be the case. But metadata can also suppress equity, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the issue around the Library of Congress subject headings for Indigenous people, many of which still reflect colonial biases and ideologies. and are, you know, at best outdated and inaccurate and at worst offensive, but are still being widely used despite, you know, fairly long-term lobbying to change them. And there have been changes made, but they're by no means comprehensive changes. So I think this is a really good example. You know, metadata is inherently biased. Whoever created it, whether it's you, me, whoever, we're going to incorporate our own biases, and being aware of that and working to address that is really important. And then finally, metadata to support contributor recognition, and credit the contributor roles taxonomy is a good example of this. It's fairly early days. It's just been formalized actually as an ISO standard. And at the moment in its current iteration, which was its original iteration, there are just 14 roles, and they are primarily contributor roles for those working in STEM subjects and those about publications of journal article publication primarily. Now that it has been formalised in that version, we are forming a standing committee and a community of interest group that is looking to expand much more broadly so that it enables recognition for other disciplines, for other types of roles, not just publication and so on. And this, I think, is a really important way that we can, that this sort of metadata can help us move away from metrics that we all know are flawed, like the impact factor. I can't really talk about metadata without saying a little bit about FAIR and the FAIR principles. And again, I'm sure you're all familiar with these, so I'm not going to dwell on them. But I think making sure that the metadata that we create is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable is really, really important. And also adhering to the CARE principles, which you may be familiar with, or they're relatively new to me, so you may be less familiar with them. But these are some principles that have been developed to help ensure that metadata is respectful of the needs and priorities of Indigenous people. So making sure that they are, there's a collective benefit to them, so that Indigenous people derive benefit from the data, making sure that they have the authority to control their data, and making sure that, that the data is used responsibly, and demonstrating how it can be used to help Indigenous peoples, and being ethical about it, prioritising Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being as we collect data and use it. So it's always good to think about what we can do at a personal level. Often I think the world, particularly at the moment, seems to be, a lot of things seem to be out of our hands, and you can feel a little hopeless and helpless. But I think when it comes to metadata, there are some concrete things that we can do both at an individual and an organisational level that will then have a cumulative effect at the community level. So most of these, numbers 1 to 8, are taken from Metadata 2020, and then 9 and 10 are my own additions to this list. So connecting to what already exists is always smart, right? We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to use things that are already there. They may need some adaptation. Sometimes something new will need to be created, but there is a lot of best practices and schema and other community resources out there. I think actually persistent identifiers are a good example. Don't go creating more PIDs unless you really, really need them. There's lots out there, or plenty out there already, that will probably meet most of your needs. And then don't just sort of look at what already exists, but adopt the best practices around those schema. Follow the guidelines that have been created. Again, if adaptations are needed, if improvements are needed, these things are evolving. But don't just sort of, again, I'll use a PID example. Don't adopt ORCID IDs, but then not ask people to log into their ORCID records when they want to connect them to something. You don't want manual entry of persistent identifiers is not a good idea. I think number 3 is a really interesting one. Honour the strategic nature of metadata. So metadata shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be an integral part of the content that you or your authors are creating. So really think about it as a strategic priority for you and your organisation and your authors. Prepare for evolving needs. As I said, we're going to need to continue to update and curate metadata. I think the Library of Congress example is a good one. There's still clearly work to be done on that, but it demonstrates the need to continue to curate and update metadata. PIDs, taxonomies and other tools will help you facilitate discoverability. We talked a little bit about that already. I think adopting this continuous improvement, don't just sort of, it's not one and done. Don't just sort of, okay, here's what we're going to do with metadata, right, done that, on to the next thing. You want to keep seeing how you can make it easier for users to use it, keep this attitude of continuous improvement. And then also act on issues. So when it's found, if somebody reports an issue to you, you make it easy for them to report those issues and then act on it. Don't just, you know, ignore them. I know, again, my former job was at Orchid, and you know, people, it was a community effort to report issues. And when you're relying on your community to help police what's going on with your system identifiers or whatever, it behooves you to then act on what they tell you. And take a personal role in making metadata richer. There must be at least one, probably more, of these things that you personally can do in your own work. And then my additions are, first, check your assumptions. As I say, bias is very easily replicated in metadata. So, and we all have bias, we can't get rid of that, but making sure that you're aware of it and doing what you can to address it is really important. And then be fair and care. So to conclude, I do honestly think metadata can help save the world, but it's a community effort, and we can do it, but we all need to pitch in to help. Thank you. So I think I'll turn over to you now, Brian.
Great, thank you. Let's see, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Great.
I see a Zoom United screen.
Well, that's what I'm promoting. Let's try it. How does that look?
Perfect.
More relevant. Here we go. Great. So following from Alice, which I appreciate, that is, so Scholastica, we're based in Chicago, and the Field Museum in our hometown has a wonderful statement, which I borrowed a good bit from, talking about that this area is traditional homelands, many indigenous nations, which are listed here. So again, I want to thank Alice, per her last point, sort of caring, taking a personal role, which we'll talk about in the journal area. But with these presentations, she sort of models and helps sensitize people, including myself, to having these sorts of acknowledgements. So thank you. Alice talked a good bit about sort of the why. We decided to do this a little bit with the sort of why and then how. And so I'm going to get a little more into the technical side, or maybe it's operational side, of how do we enhance metadata. Note, so I work with Scholastica. Why am I talking about this? So we work with about 1,100 journals, and we have peer review. So we're actually helping collect metadata. We do production, so formatting, PDFs, HTML, but also XML, sending metadata out to different places like Crossref, PMC, DOAJ. And my background, I'm a developer. And so this is something that I've worked on, I care about, and work with a lot of our publishers, many of whom are smaller, and I'll sort of talk about this, where they're sort of trying to get their metadata out there. And so we've seen a lot of the challenges firsthand. So I'm going to speak to some of that. I was sharing with Alice when we were talking about this session that I've been trying to push myself recently to always talk about the why more. And because I think, again, I can often get into the how. And so for myself, I thought about this for this audience. Why do we care about discoverability? And I think there's the contribution that Alice spoke to, but I also think for many library publishers, when I think about the partners we work with, there's, they're mission driven. I mean, the larger organizations are mission driven, but often the programs exist because there were either problems or needs that they wanted to solve in their community, that they wanted to help people who wanted to publish a journal or start a journal have resources and expertise and a support network. Also, every time I love being involved with LPForum, there's this this sort of I don't know, anti-establishment trend where I think a lot of the library publishing programs, on some level, they're also trying to prove out this sort of myth. I mean, over the last, I don't know, forever, but say the last 15 years, as you see more consolidation in our industry and all this, there can be this idea of, well, if you're not publishing with one of the largest corporate publishers, are you sort of a real journal? Are you doing this correctly? And I think there's so many amazing programs from library publishers, and there are examples of this democratization where it's not just these large, sort of a few large publishers, you don't have to be at a certain scale, that you can actually do very high quality publishing on your own terms. When we talk about academic-led publishing, library publishing programs are just at the forefront of that. And so whenever we think about discoverability, that is one way to think about the programs being successful, sort of proving out that model, which is we're not just publishing it, but it is found, and that it is making an impact on the scholarly record. And I think when we talk about equitable research dissemination, library programs are doing that. They're working with journals and authors, and they're getting them into the scholarly record. And again, often working with journals who are not, by definition, working with these sort of mainstream large publishers. And some of the content, I think, helps, library publishing programs might be working with journals that are helping to sensitize people to some of even the issues we're talking about. I think a lot of humanities journals, social science journals, who are sort of writing about this. And so I think, it's important to both acknowledge, but also I think for me, celebrate that this group, that it really, it really does matter. Okay, but let's get back to technical, because I think from, Alice, there's a little bit of, from her talk, it's sort of, well, what do we do now if we sort of agree and say, we should do this, we understand the role and mission, or how metadata can help our mission, what do we do? So I'm going to go through a couple sort of explanations, but then have some action steps that might be helpful. So first, when we talk about how, sort of how are metadata shared, that's something, there are other answers, but this typology I find very useful. Sort of it's on your website, and so then people come and get it. You put it into a form, so you're sending it somewhere, or you're generating something that is meant to be disseminated, very often XML. So I'll speak a little bit more to that. I think many people here are familiar with Google Scholar. They have a web crawler, and so what does that mean? It crawls around the web, it finds links and goes on then like a spider among the connections on the web to find content and add it to its index. And I'll speak more to that. Web form, so Crossref, DOAJ, other places, you can copy and paste or sort of type in things, then they put that into their index. And then, there are a lot of indexes where you can submit XML, or you can submit into things like Crossref, XML as well. And, across these, the sort of website headers are very machine friendly, and they don't look great to humans. The web form is very nice for humans, and sort of translates that into something that's good for computers. And XML is often the best and richest for computers and the hardest for humans to make, but is also the industry standard. I think that's so many ways that people discover, whether that's through library searches or going to indexes, under the hood they're sort of using XML, and so that's one of the reasons it is the standard. So we talk about that. I'll start with those crawlers. When we talk about the headers in your website, this is what they look like. The good thing is you can go to a website and right click and view content and sort of look for these, search for the term citation underscore author, and you'll see, like, do you have something like that? A lot of the platforms people might be using, OJS, using Scholastica, Janeway, they're going to sort of handle this. If you're hand coding a site, you might not have these, and it's really onerous to do if it's not automatically generated, because sort of when we talk about rich metadata, you often want a lot, and sort of having to remember even to sort of create this is rough. But the good thing is we're in a nice technological time where most of the platforms people would be using will generate this, but that's what it looks like. And again, Google Scholar, and there are other indexes that will actually come to the site and get those metadata. And I'll just note one challenge with this is, and if you've ever dealt with this, sometimes authors will say, oh, well, I showed my articles in Google Scholar, but it's linking to the wrong version, or it's linking to somewhere else. What's going on? Well, Google Scholar goes to institutional repositories. It goes to academics, websites if they have metadata. There's sort of lots of places, and you might find that Google Scholar decides the PDF is the best version, even though you've done all this work to create a really beautiful HTML version, and you wanted to be the sort of canonical one, Google Scholar has their own formula and algorithm. So you don't always have control over that. And that's just a reality. It's also free. That's something you can always remind people that, it's a very small team within a massive company that's producing this important piece, this sort of important resource for discoverability. But again, we don't have control over it. That's often different than places where we're filling out the web form or sending XML. We're sort of controlling it. Something in Google Scholar, we can't sort of directly input that. They sort of decide how they're going to handle that. This is a note also, this is from Google Scholar's sort of implementation. It's back to what I was saying. It's rough if you're doing this by hand, but even they sort of say, look, you probably want to look for software package. I'm going to mention that because most people are probably covered by this just by what they're using to host. So that's good. I mentioned web forums. I think people are familiar with these. Filling stuff in. The downside of a web form is, I think for most people, is you have to remember to do it. The idea is you publish an issue and that's this big win. And then the idea of saying, okay, now I need to go to, 6 different places and sort of copy and paste things in, especially when I think editors are in charge of that. It is something that is very easy to fall by the wayside. And I say all that because why that's especially important is getting it published is, this idea of you built it, but people won't know about it. You can have a concert. If you don't advertise it, no one's going to show up. That is sort of a basic, if you've ever promoted any event on a college campus, it takes a lot to get people to show up. And so this is sort of a version of that. If people aren't doing this step, that's going to be a challenge. So last one I mentioned is, XML. This is the sort of a challenge. It can be a challenge to create. Again, lots of software will generate this, or there are ways to do it. But something I want to mention is this is daunting for lots of programs. What's often something I've been thinking a lot about is part of the promise, I think, of XML is this idea of, well, if I can make it, then I have this really sort of powerful record of my article in XML, and I can put it in all these different places. And one of the takeaways over the years, we've sort of helped customers we work with understand, publishers, is that, XML is a format. It's sort of like saying house, but there are lots of different kinds of houses. And we talk about ice cream. Internally, we started using this, and we've actually been helpful to understand is, saying we have JATS, you have JATS XML, it's sort of this standard, it's this important format. Well, there are different versions of it, so different flavors, and even different indexes. So for example, we've had journals who they produce XML and they go to PMC and they upload their XML and they get a lot of errors. And it's because there can be more stringent rules. And an example I've used other places is in XML, you can have an article type of anything you want. Your article type could be called, the electric slide. But when you upload that into PMC, they're going to say, whoa, we only have, I don't remember the number, 15 sort of accepted article types. And that's true with, things like Silverchair, and different places where you might put data. They might have different rules, how figures should have their titles. Should it be sort of 1 element or 2? There's these different rules. And if you look, Crossref and DOAJ have their own version, it's called a DTD, of how they define how they want data set. And so that's one of the things I hope, it's not meant to scare people, but it's when you think about XML, creating it, thinking of it as something you might potentially making versions of is helpful. And it's also why for a lot of people, when they talk about what is their, like yesterday there was a great talk about audits, so like program audits, and sometimes the idea of core competency or scalability, like can we do this? When you have journals, as we all know, sort of getting them published, getting a nice looking PDF is one challenge, getting it looking good in HTML. The point at which you're making XML, it's probably because the journal needs it for something. And then if that same journal is like, oh, we got into PMC or we got into this other index, we need that other version of XML. Well, now you're making multiple versions. It can be, again, challenging. Depending on what you're doing, again, you can work with vendors. There might be plugins you can use, but it is sort of why all this matters, and I'll sort of talk about this is, this is an example of what XML looks like. not always fun, is that this XML, like I said, is an output. So there are multiple versions of it. But in the end, all these are formats to get sort of from the article when it's published to get that metadata out into the world. Because what happens is any of these versions, the data can move. So if you fill out that web form in DOAJ, people here are probably familiar, those metadata can suddenly go into, you see them showing up in your library search engines, they show up in different indexes, especially if in DOAJ and you do it for the article. Some people, and you can do quite a bit there. Crossref is another great example. Data moves all over the place. And so getting it in there is just such a massive sort of improvement of how the metadata where the metadata can go. And so that's sort of about getting the metadata somewhere outside of, or even just creating it, but getting it places where it can be useful. And I want to think about quality of metadata. And so something, again, we talk about is I think about each metadata element is sort of a hook for discoverability. So it's a different way that article can be discovered. So in all, we think about title. Well, if you don't, title, abstract, these are ways people could search for keywords, but lots of things we've, talk about. So your ORCID ID, people could search for, author names, but also they could search for institutions where they're at. We talk about ROAR. If someone wants to say, I'm really interested in research that happened in the Southwest, being able to sort of do that, if the metadata is rich and includes, geographic things or institutional identifiers, which can scope, that's really amazing. If they want to say, there was this important grant that funded a certain kind of, community art project, I want to see all the publications that reference that. Well, if it has funding data, you can sort of see that. And these are, again, there are new tools coming out all the time that help people sort of cluster knowledge in ways that are different than we used to think of. They're sort of just the content. Data citations, data having DOIs are also ways to sort of see who's using the same kind of data. And then references. I mean, this is really so powerful. And again, Crossref's doing a lot with this, being able to say, well, there's this important work, who is sort of cited that and who's building off of that work? If we have metadata, so structured metadata with this information, these are new ways people can be discovered. And so again, I was first trying to talk about getting metadata so it's accessible to web crawlers and search engines, but then the quality of metadata. Because I think, again, step one is definitely title, abstract, authors, DOI. I'll talk more about that. But after that, thinking about enriching programs and sort of within the journal's field, what are hooks that might be really important? Because why does discoverability matter? People will reference that. Authors will be elated to see their work cited. It helps their careers. So again, we talk about equitable research dissemination. I think about the more hooks we have for all kinds of publishing programs and all kinds of authors and all kinds of works, the more chances of that work being elevated within searches and within the scholarly record. And so, right, so this idea of the more possible connections you have, the more chance for discoverability. I was talking to Alice, and I've also thought about each metadata is sort of a lottery ticket. So the more metadata you have, the more lottery tickets you get for your work to sort of be cited or referenced or be used in the scholarly record. And so, that's powerful. Great. So as library publishers, what do we do with this? We care about it. What do we do? So generally starting with, I usually think about the website, because often, title, abstract, DOI, that's sort of the basic. Do you have a DOI? If so, you're putting those data most likely into Crossref, could, I guess, be some other DOI minting, but it's probably Crossref. And that already gets that article into, tons of places and lots of hooks available. And so I often think of like step one, because that's almost like, the entrance to the world. If you have that DOI with some metadata, the article it has its visa, it can travel. And now we can talk about quality improvements. If you're a member of Crossref, they have these great participation reports where you can, look at a journal's corpus and look at, do they have the references, funders, ORCID IDs, et cetera. Abstracts is a great one. Are abstracts included in there? And see where they are. So this can be helpful for when you think about an audit. And again, on that note, for me, the goal is always not to get not to be to have 100% on everything, or that could be a goal. I think that's great, but that's almost a vision, sort of, the long-term thing you're never going to reach. There's this idea in software development, and you can use it in project management, but within Agile is I try and boil it down to this. And when we work with journals, we really try and encourage them, every program has different resources, different number of staff, different personalities with the editorial board, different tolerances for planning and auditing. If you ever had an editor who just sort of wants to get it done and doesn't want to sort of see a bunch of long docs, that might resonate. And we see a lot of value within that sort of very diverse library publishing ecosystem of taking an approach where you say, where are we? What's something we can add? And I actually usually encourage people to say, what's the easiest? I do think, again, DOIs are almost in their own class. But after that, if someone says, well, funding information would be ideal, and it feels like a huge challenge, but for example, including, right, they've only been including the primary author, and they could include more authors. Like, that's such a huge win. And it's, slightly lower hanging fruit. Or they suddenly realize their website doesn't have those, and sort of figuring out, is that something where it's turn a plugin on, or do something where it's a lot easier, or where it's easier to implement, and then come back. Because where I say this is sometimes programs want to have a list of, spend months saying, well, what would our ideal look like? What would it take to get there? And the end result feels so heavy to actually implement that nothing happens. And that's just a human experience, that you can get planning fatigue and then intimidation from the scale. And so when we talk about more metadata is more hooks and more chance of discoverability, which can enhance sort of, your program, its research dissemination, like, impact. But getting one more hook is a win. And you can celebrate that. And thinking over time, those adding up. So this idea of like iterate within Agile, over time, these things will add up, and your content will be more discoverable, which again proves out on some level that the publishing program helps authors and the journals, their content be more discoverable, be more disseminated, more cited, and more impact. One thing, and again, maybe it's self-serving as a vendor, but we love when people email us with, how would you recommend we do this? Because I don't know, 30% of the time we're like, oh, we check a box, it's done. Like, we can handle that. And sometimes that's true. Depending on what software you're using, there's lots of community groups, Q&A, but often you can just email them. And I think, scholarly publishing is a pretty, I think generally a pretty nice area, and people want to be helpful. And so even this in terms of like, is there any, a question we don't get that often, but when we do, I think it's really helpful, is there anything we're not doing that we essentially, can easily do? Like, is there anything you see that we could just turn on and enhance our publishing program? And again, sometimes the answer is yes. Here's 3 things. And again, I think there might be low-hanging, this is all to say, there might be easy wins that aren't obvious to you, but your partners, your vendors might know about. And this is another one, is that depending on where you're going, a very low-hanging fruit is to ask authors for metadata during submission. And this can start with asking authors to include, in a separate document that has things you might want in the future, keywords or grant information or whatever. And so you have it in the future and you sort of get used to it. I mean, ideally, you could set up your, for example, peer review submission form where you're asking for more things like ORCID. We had a journal who started requiring ORCID, and I think they did a wonderful job. I don't think no, I didn't add a screenshot, sorry, but they added a note for authors, because in their field, ORCID is, I would say, is not ubiquitous. It's not a field where everyone has one. And they sort of explained why they value it and how it helps with research dissemination. So they not only collected it, they required it, which is, sort of a high bar. And they did a good job with messaging. And again, I think the moment of entering it, so the author's like, oh, why do I have to do this? Or I don't even know what that is. They sort of explain, you can sign up in under 2 minutes. If you don't have one, here's how it helps with your research discovery. It's helpful for the journal, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the more you can collect it, submission versus wanting to add it later, because it's much more difficult to, for example, you can't fill out the web form with metadata if you don't have it. So that might seem obvious, but sort of, even if you have to ask for it in a non-structured way up front, you can always figure out how to add it structured later. And yeah, so I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk about more nitty gritty, but hopefully some of that was helpful.